Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews, and I thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Power of High Quality Instructional Materials. Today's webinar is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies, and they want you to know that the nation's largest social studies gathering is just weeks away in Nashville, and you can go to socialstudies.org/conference to sign up, to find out who's going to be involved, the sessions. It is quite an active and wonderful chance to connect with social studies educators and professionals from around the country and around the world. Please go to socialstudies.org/conference to find out more. The webinar is also brought to you by inquirED. We say that you should ask more of your K-5 social studies curriculum. Inquiry Journeys gives teachers the tools for high quality hands-on instructions. It boosts student outcomes, builds deep social studies content knowledge, and develops literacy and critical thinking skills. You can go to inquirED.org to find out more. Right now, I would like to stop my share and bring Shanti Elangovan on. She is the founder and CEO of inquirED. And thanks for joining us today, Shanti.
Hey, Martin. How's it going?
And she's actually going to be facilitating an interview, a conversation today. And Shanti, I'm going to disappear into the chat and let you bring on our special guest today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Good to see everyone. I haven't been on a webinar for us in a while, so I'm glad to be back here with you all. I'm really excited to welcome our guest today. Larry, if you want to turn your camera on so you're not the ghost behind. Thanks for joining us, Larry. Just to do a quick intro on Larry, for those of you who might not know who he is, Larry Berger is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Amplify. He has led the invention of mobile software to help early reading teachers in next generation curriculum for elementary and middle schools. Larry was a Rhodes Scholar and a White House Fellow working on educational technology at NASA and a Pahara Aspen Education Fellow. He serves on the boards of Touch Press, the Academy of American Poets. Is it LAPHAM's Quarterly? Is that right? Yeah.
It is.
The Institute for Sustained Attention and the Southern Education Foundation. I'll get off of that whole thing and just say that Amplify is a pretty big whale, and inquirED's a little fish and a growing fish. But even when we were a little minnow, Larry is a person that takes calls from little minnows, which I have just so appreciated. And so just want to say, as a founder who's been early on in my trajectory, Larry's always been willing to talk about things. So just want to say he's one of my favorite people in education. So thanks for being here.
And I think that while you may have been a minnow at the time, you are some breed of fish that is growing rapidly and has remarkable power.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, we're here to talk about instructional materials and high quality instructional materials. So I'd love to start by just having you talk a little bit to our audience about what high quality instructional materials means. What is this thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, it is. The definition is a little bit elusive. It's something that people throw around often to sort of say, these ones are in the high quality instructional materials list and these ones are out. And then the rules of how you get in and out are a little bit uncertain. But I do think that there are some characteristics that were envisioned by the people who crafted that acronym and have been trying to get behind this movement. And if I had to say, the heart of it is educational publishing had become something of a standards compliance activity run largely by the big publishers. And this isn't a big publisher could certainly ship a high quality instructional materials program, but something had happened where states came out with standards and frameworks, and I think editorial teams were just writing drearily compliant documents so that a committee would say, I guess this hits all our requirements, but a teacher, a student might not think that this was a quality form of pedagogy or that this was something that would light the light in the minds of a kid. And I think what the high quality instructional materials movement was about was people who had sat down to say, how do we make social studies come alive? How do we make science come alive? How do we make ELA come alive? How do we make it rigorous? What's the truth of this discipline that we want to convey? And as a compliance activity, we'll make sure that this wonderful learning experience we're trying to create hits the state requirements so it can get adopted and funded in all those ways. But the starting place was somewhere around what would it mean to teach this discipline in a really rigorous way that would get kids excited. And I think in the early days of the movement, people were sort of making lists and saying some of these programs are doing that and some of them aren't. And of course, they do have to be compliant with the standards. And some of the movement sprung up around when the college and career ready standards were new and when the next generation science standards were new. There were a lot of programs that simply weren't compliant, and that also kind of became part of this distinction, that these new programs had been written with some of the more enlightened things that were driving the new standards. It had been written with them in mind. So in science, one of the big ideas of the next generation science standards is that they are phenomenon based. There's a big scientific idea that unites what kids are learning across lots of parts of a domain of science, and that was in the standards. A lot of the traditional programs just didn't have a way to do that because their books were organized by chapter, just kind of marching through standard by standard. There wasn't a unifying phenomenon, and so some of this was to call out those cases and say, some people are doing this, other people aren't. Let's make sure that districts can see those lists.
Yeah. As you think about kind of the difference of curriculum, and you kind of hit on it a little bit, versus high quality instructional materials, and you said, high quality instructional materials in social studies, to be very frank, high quality instructional materials hasn't been words that are used that much in the social studies world. They've been used in science, they've been used in math, they've been used in ELA, but not as much in social studies. And so for our social studies folks, as they're thinking about like how they might differentiate, like what does it look like? What is Larry talking about? He's talking about curriculum and high quality instructional materials. What might be some of the things that they look for in determining a high quality instructional material?
I have, and again, this is my idiosyncratic definition, but it's the one that I kind of stick with and try to make sure my teams are following. Ask someone who is a real historian, a real sociologist, a real anthropologist, the disciplines that are feeding into political scientists would work too. What is the game that you play all day at work? And I always like that thing because it forces them to say, not, I'm a scholar of this thing, but what's the game you play? And at first they don't understand me, and I keep pushing on it. And they say, oh, okay, well, I look at primary source documents of a period of history that is controversial, and I try to figure out, a truth that I can tell. Or I'm a political scientist. I use a combination of geography and understanding of political systems to try to predict what will happen in different geopolitical contexts. Whatever it is, they describe the game. And I think it's great to then write down what that game is and then ask, do kids who are learning this get to play that game ever? And if they aren't playing that game, if they're just learning the facts of that discipline, the terminology of that discipline, then I would say that is not a high quality instructional materials offering. And so, I not to do an advertisement for inquirED, but I sense that this definition of the program is, what are the kinds of inquiry that people who practice the discipline of the social sciences, history, geography, what do they do? What do they wonder about? What are their inquiries? And how can we put kids in a learning version of that?
Yeah. It's really an important point, I think, to think about. How have you seen it reshape the areas of, if you can pick one, ELA, math, or science? You all are swimming in all of those areas. So how have you seen the high quality instructional materials reshape those folks? Because again, to hit it on it again, for us in social studies, it's really kind of a new space. And so what's been the effect on the landscape?
It has led to situations where sometimes smaller companies without the big sales forces of the big publishers get on the list of high quality materials, and districts notice them and say, well, I haven't heard of this little company, but someone thinks they are an instance of HQIM, or someone I trust thinks they are. And that I think brings more and more interesting providers to the fore. I think it has led to contexts where districts are inclined to try the curriculum before they buy it. There's a historical way that a curricula have been adopted, that is, we go into a conference room, the publishers have their books stacked up, we flip through them and we choose one. And when they're all kind of the same, and we're just picking among the illustrations or the author that we respect, that might be a perfectly viable way to do it. But the high quality instructional materials are trying to create a classroom experience, a learning experience that might be new to the kids, new to the teacher. And that question of, like, can we do this? Do we like doing this? Does the promise that something new is happening in this classroom actually happen? And so to me, one of the most exciting things is people have gone from what is sometimes called the flip test. They go in, they flip through the pages, to genuinely piloting. And I think when they do that, teachers say, oh, there is a difference between these things. And so I think those are two things that have happened. I think discussions of quality, and what do we think quality is? Discussions of vertical articulation. What are we hoping our second, our third graders, our fifth graders can do? And does this build in some coherent way their abilities in this discipline? And I could go on, but I do think there are subtle changes. But like everything in schools, there are people who buy the new book and just implement it like the old book, and then there are those who really say, this is an opportunity to change. Let's go through that change. Let's learn our way into these new materials, and that is essential to whether the high quality part of these materials ends up expressing itself or not.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you made about the piloting and kind of moving past the flip test, because I think it connects to the definition you were giving about high quality instructional materials and this idea of the students playing the game. Because on the surface, you can see content, right? You can see, does this cover the American Revolution, and does this cover the American Revolution? And you can see that on the surface. You can't, it's very difficult to see pedagogy and how that plays out in a flip test. And so what you're getting at is that opportunity for teachers to really, and district administrators to get into that. How, I think, though, one of the challenges with that is that oftentimes these high quality instructional materials are actually asking quite a lot of the teacher in the classroom. And so I'd be curious to just hear a little bit from you about kind of the tension of how that's played out for you all at Amplify, or just in your experiences of kind of what we're asking for in terms of rigor and time and all of those pieces from teachers, shifts in instructional practices and the reality of all the things going on, but our desire for more in the classroom.
It's such a key question. And if one of the thoughts is maybe a version of the HQIM movement will make its way into social studies, I think getting this question right seems really important, because what we found was that that districts that had a conversation about a wish to transition to high quality instructional materials, or to at the very least, like, really discuss, what do these new science standards mean in terms of changing practice, changing content? If they had a context for what they were looking for, then when they saw something that was different, that was new, that was inviting their kids to think in certain ways that other programs had not, they're like, great, that's the thing we were looking for. This new thing is what we desire. There are a lot of places, the district right next door might be saying, wow, this doesn't And so that, that district is like, wow, I am embracing this. The district right next door might just say, like, this doesn't look like what we bought last time. Like, I don't know what this is. Is this, it might be good, but it's certainly unfamiliar. And then they don't decide to use it. And it might be for the best, because I'm not sure they would have succeeded if they hadn't gotten in a conversation about what they want teaching and learning to be in that discipline. I should say one other thing about this, because I've been sort of comparing lower quality curriculum materials made by publishers to high quality ones made by publishers. There's another important distinction that the HQIM movement was trying to respond to, which was the proliferation of digital tools has also made it possible to just go get pieces of curriculum from Pinterest, from Google searches, from Teachers Pay Teachers, and each one of those things might be delightful, although it's very hard to know the quality of them. Like, are these accurate? Do they have features that experts in the discipline might actually disagree with? But even if you found only high quality ones, the question of, are they assembled in a coherent way? Are you building disciplinary understanding across a grade, across the sequences of grades? Is almost certain to be not the case, because these are different people posting different things on Pinterest. So I think it was also trying to respond to that there is a certain energy in the classroom that finds fun activities just for tomorrow. But could we get that energy and a coherence from day to day was another pillar of the movement.
You're speaking in a way, in social studies, which is a very fragmented space. There's a lot of, probably more than in other subject areas, supplemental providers. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to kind of how you see the role of core materials providers and supplemental materials providers, and how, is there a role for both, or what does that look like?
So it's certainly, I don't want to paint the grass is greener outside of social studies point of view. I do think that I don't have data on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if, in certain disciplines, math is known to be one. There is more fidelity to core programs because you're teaching a sequence of mathematical understanding, and finding the exact lesson that comes next is maybe not the same as, I'm teaching an idea in political theory or a moment in history, and I can find lots of stuff that's supplemental that will address that in a way that's internally coherent, even if it doesn't fit into the rest of the program. So what I would say is we see a mix of core and supplemental everywhere. I think what we find teachers asking for is, it sure would be great if more of the supplemental things that I was finding and using tied back to the core structure. If the core itself was a little bit more transparent about what its underlying structure is. I think I saw a question show up in the chat about that, so that a teacher who wanted to be enterprising and kind of go off-piste to include something of their own from a supplemental that they believe in, or a lesson that they wrote that they love teaching, there would be a better ability to be transparent about, well, where does that fit in the mix and match of what I actually decide to do as a teacher?
Yeah. I think I'll come back to that. I want to come back at the end to talk a little bit about just like kind of the future of HQIM, and maybe how technology and integration can play a role in that. I want to switch gears for a second and talk a little bit about ELA and social studies and kind of the connection there. Your organization has been talking quite a bit about the importance of knowledge, and it's been a huge part of the Knowledge Matters movement and the significant role that knowledge plays in ELA. So first of all, like, just for folks that maybe have no idea what I'm talking about, what, like, from your end, what does knowledge have to do with ELA?
Yeah, this is, for a very long time, not a lot, or I would say very long time in recent memory, not a lot. If you look back 1,000 years, I think a lot of what it has meant to become educated is that you have a sort of comprehensive cultural literacy, that you know the things that knowledgeable people in your culture know. But sometime towards sort of in the middle of the last century, that became a less sexy educational idea, and people thought, well, maybe we can break the things kids need to know how to do into a set of discrete cognitive skills and just teach those skills, and maybe we can create a system in which that ability to think that is what we are trying to develop, and it's divorced from specific knowledge that kids have with which to think. And over the last 40 years or so, various scholars, E.D. Hirsch is kind of the main voice of this. He was a professor at the University of Virginia who started working with both the generally affluent kids who went to UVA, but also people in night school and then in high schools. And he saw that there was a huge gap in background knowledge, that he didn't actually think one group of people was smarter or had better cognitive skills. He just said some of these students know a lot about the world and can therefore use that to reason about each new issue we put in front of them. And some have been deprived of knowledge. And so he set about being very methodical about creating the knowledge that every student should have by the time they get to the end of elementary school, by the time they get to the end of middle school. And that sparked what was for a while a kind of niche movement of people who agreed with him. And then over the last decade or so, evidence started to accumulate that this was right, that when we say this kid is having trouble with reading comprehension, it may not be that they don't know what a main idea is or what the author's perspective is, that they may not be lacking certain critical skills. They just don't understand the context of this article, in the same way that if you hand me a page of theoretical physics, I know what a main idea is. I just can't find the main idea in that page of theoretical physicists because I don't have the knowledge to do that work, and that elementary kids are likely to be in exactly the same boat. And so this idea that if we are going to be teaching reading comprehension, if we're going to be developing vocabulary, two core ideas of ELA, we can't do it divorced from knowledge. We actually have to teach kids stuff. And that meant that the fondness sometimes for like storybooks with imaginary animals, which are delightful to read with young kids, and no one wants to take those away, but they don't actually build your background knowledge, had to be supplemented with books about the history of Mesopotamia, books about how kings and queens in Africa evolved through history, and science and knowledge of the human body, just the things that an adult human uses to reason with, and that the newspaper assumes you know about when they write articles, and that ELA programs should be teaching that. That goes close to the realm of social studies in terms of a lot of the humanities. And in fact, many of these ELA programs have a lot more historical and social analytical texts than they would have a few years ago. But none of them goes so far at this point, as far as I know, to be like a unified ELA and social studies program. Although people are getting close because they're seeing the importance of knowledge in delivering on the things that a ELA teacher has to do, let alone its merit in its own right as social studies and history.
Yeah. Let's dig in on that a little bit, because just transparently, as a social studies provider, we hear a lot from our district partners that kind of the struggle for instructional time there, because content-based literacy programs are hitting on some what you would say is like historical topics. Then the idea is like, okay, is this enough for social studies? Because I don't have my content-based literacy program might be taking me 2 or 3 hours a day. My math program might be taking an hour to 2 hours. There's, transition periods. There's all the things, and the day's done. And so I'm curious to hear from you is just kind of like how you think districts could be and should be grappling with that challenge.
Yeah, it's, the first thing is like, it is worth doing the scrutiny of any schedule to make sure that there is time for the core disciplines, and the fact that we measure 2 of them and not the others has created a kind of overweighting of ELA and math to the detriment of the arts and science and social studies. So one part of it is just there needs to be the education leadership. Sometimes it's the community leadership. It takes the school board to just say, what are we doing with the 6 hours that kids are in school? And surely there is time to in 6 hours to cover the subjects we seek to cover. And then I do think there is something to be said for much tighter integration between the agenda of the social studies teacher, who in early grades is very likely to also be the ELA teacher and the math teacher. But let's talk about them as two different people, because even that one teacher wears two different hats. To try to get the two activities aligned, so that when I think about what I am reading in history and social studies, I am doing so in a way that feeds my building of general background knowledge that is one of the agendas of my ELA outcomes, and that I think of history and social studies as subjects that are delivering the reading comprehension scores. Even if I'm not explicitly teaching reading comprehension, I'm teaching kids the knowledge with which they comprehend text. And I think whenever there's a subject that grabs all the attention and mind share, you want to team up with that subject. And so, not saying anything about the superiority of ELA as a discipline, especially in this audience, but really it's just they've got the power. And so figuring out how the social studies project aligns with, doesn't compete with, is part of the ELA program, I think, is the exciting opportunity of this knowledge matters agenda, where people have realized that you can't get the ELA results that you want if you don't build background knowledge, and social studies, history, and geography are fundamental to that.
Yeah. I'm going to throw some friendly fire at you. And so, there is a real challenge in what you're talking about, because the content in most content-based literacy curriculums aren't necessarily aligned to what's happening in the social studies standards. And so the teacher's left kind of being like, wait, how do I grapple with these two things? So I'd love to just have you speak to that a little bit, because, and I agree, by the way, like there's a real challenge is the funding is in ELA. And so like definitely it would be naive for us in social studies to think that there isn't a power differential there. There's lots of reasons, and we'd like that to be different, but there is. But that really, there can be a challenge of like how that actually plays out in the classroom.
Yeah, no, that is not just friendly fire. That's just true. And I do think it's one of the kind of moments of incoherence in the system. What I will say is that the core knowledge movement, as it relates to ELA, is both all about knowledge and the idea that there is stuff you have to know, and entirely flexible about what subset of that stuff you might get done in elementary school, because you obviously can't give kids all the knowledge that ever was, and also like what years you teach it in. And so I do think that there is a place for saying, whatever the sort of social studies agenda was in the ELA program, let's carve that time away and use the standards aligned stuff that we have for social studies instead. And even though I am the publisher of a book with those things, I would find that to be a rigorous choice, as long as the social studies program is building an analogous amount of background knowledge.
I'm going to clip you there, Larry. Send it to our districts right there.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think we'd have to be methodical. There are certain things that, totally. That we do with sort of decodable readers that are tied to the historical or social periods that we may be teaching. But, I do think there are some high-performing charter schools and high-performing private schools relieved of the scrutiny for complying with the state standards in quite the same way, who just do this. They say, we will have an aligned science, social studies, ELA essentially reading block. You could call it a science block, whatever, a sort of team taught, again in elementary, by the same teacher, integration of those disciplines. And I've even heard one, I don't know if I can quote him, but one like very influential state commissioner of education saying like, I am going to try to build towards that moment where our standards in those three disciplines, and maybe math too, but it's not as fraught there, are built from the ground up in an aligned way, so that this discordance that we're describing isn't there.
Yeah. I'm going to encourage our audience to put any questions they have. I've seen some in the audience, but keep them coming in there as we'll switch to audience Q&A in a few minutes. I'd love to pivot, unless anything else on ELA and social studies that you want to hit on before we go to kind of thinking a little bit about the future of the high quality instructional movement.
I mean, I guess I would just say the one other, like I spoke about it in terms of knowledge, but I don't want to lose sight of also the tools of the discipline that ELA would tend to say its tools are literary analysis, text-based analysis, which of course are the tools of social studies. But there are principles of what it means to do rigorous historical analysis, rigorous anthropological, sociological, geographical analysis that of course make you better at reading and writing arguments in any discipline. And so just to call out that the really elegant fusion of these is not just bodies of knowledge, but practices of thinking in both reading and writing that would be more unified.
Yeah, and you get to kind of the point too that I think I really want to emphasize to our attendees is that you could say like this is a content question. Oh, well, the content of that ELA program isn't hitting on all of the social studies. Okay, that maybe we reconcile that in some way, but actually the ELA, that content-based literacy program, is also not doing what you talked about earlier, which is that playing the game of what social studies, the disciplinary skills that we are asking those students to build, and all of the other pieces that go beyond just the content. And so I think it's really important to make that call out too of what else social studies is intended to do and where that ELA program isn't intended to do that, and where that doesn't do that. Yeah, I appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit about the future of high quality instructional materials. So just like, where do you see the movement going from here as you think about kind of moving forward?
Yeah, it's this is, I think, a moment of a lot of volatility. There's a thing that happens in schools where if being an HQIM program makes it easier to sell that program, to get adopted, then everybody starts asking, what's the new list of requirements I have to comply with to become HQIM? And I think there is the problem of the dreary form of compliance sort of finding its way back in, because at some point you can't tell someone who's checked all the boxes that you defined as HQIM that they're not getting a good score on your measure of HQIM. And then it turns back into a kind of craft knowledge, experts in the field having strong opinions, sharing those opinions. And I am hopeful that something is about to happen where the tools we have to understand the student work coming out of curriculum materials will start to be the plane on which we evaluate whether they are high quality or not. There's a certain way in which, as teachers, this seems completely obvious. What I care about is the work that kids do, the conversations we have, the things they are capable as a result of this curriculum. But when evaluating curriculum, that's not really what states do. They just say, like, is there content in here for each of the things? And the question of whether that content would inspire kids to study further or put them to sleep is lost on that adoption process. And I think there are increasingly tools. Some of them are we've gone pretty far in an education conversation without saying the word AI, but it snuck in there.
Trying really hard, Larry.
So some of the AI ones are good examples of this, that are actually happy to look at student work across lots and lots of assignments in lots of drawings, pictures, written stuff, and formulate opinions about the quality and level of engagement and just quantity of it. I once did an quasi-formal study with some support from the Gates Foundation, just asking teachers, like, what is the thing that a great teacher does? And I had a long list of things. They're knowledgeable in the subject. They're great at connecting emotionally with kids. But one of the things on the list was they get kids to do more work. And it was really interesting how teachers were like, yep, that's the one. Because it includes all the other ones. You don't inspire kids to do more work if you aren't engaging them, if you're not connecting with them, if the curriculum that you're teaching isn't intellectual, and if they don't believe that, like, impressing you is something they aspire to do. And so I would love to see, but I wouldn't hold our breath in the short term, but I think in a few years it will start to be that we start to have rigorous ways of looking at what is the nature of the work kids do, which is not how do they score on a test. It's not, is the content compliant, but are they asking interesting questions, doing good work, engaging across different media and different modalities? Are they fired up about the discourse of this discipline? And I don't think we're that far from changing the conversation to looking at student work.
Yeah. I'm going to kick it to our audience because I think Martin has some questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask him to come back on. And then thank you, Larry, for chatting with me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, sure. So let me bring some questions in, as if others come up to participants, just continue to fill up the chat. We have a question generally about, someone said that their district is focused on high quality instructional materials, but they still feel they don't have a really great sense of what a high quality instructional material is. So there's this desire that this person expressed: I'm interested in finding a clearly articulated definition, explanation of high quality instructional materials. Does that exist out there somewhere? And I can share resources afterwards, but that was the question we had.
Yeah, well, I would say there are some resources. I am not sure that any of them distills down to like a clearly articulated cutoff of the sort that I think the question is asking. So I do think and it is probably also somewhat discipline specific. So like, it's not these criteria work from math programs and social studies programs. I think it is. So I would look to the organizations who think about quality in social studies to ask what their emerging definition of it would be. And in the end, I think what it means to say your district is interested in this, I actually think, is that you are going to try to test some different programs for what happens. It doesn't mean the whole district has to run a pilot. It means find some teachers who care about social studies or whichever discipline you're adopting. Look to the experts in the field about which things seem to be getting on lists of high quality instructional materials, but then try them. Make sure that they actually work for the kids that you teach, and try them knowing that if they're really good, they are asking for some changes that won't be familiar to you. That was the topic that came up. So there's going to be something that seems different and new, but if teachers sort of see that, get a taste of that power, kids seem to be engaging in a way that works, then it might be time to roll up our sleeves and really do the change management to not just get a taste of it, but be successful with that program. But I think it might be an experiential thing, not a checklist.
Larry, let me ask you this. We had Jim Short from the Carnegie Foundation on maybe a couple of webinar series ago, and he talked about high quality instructional materials in terms of one thing that you can look for is a volume of materials for teachers actually being much more than you may have traditionally thought about in the curriculum that you and I grew up with. Because in that curriculum, some of the things that you're asking for in terms of how that content comes out to play in the classroom requires the teacher to be really like thinking about the pedagogy and like how this, like what is happening in the facilitation of this in the classroom. And so if you just have a textbook for the student, for example, can that be a high quality instructional material? And he was pushing on and saying, no, he doesn't think that it can be. But I'm curious to hear from you how you respond to that.
So I think he's right about that. My only concern is that the phenomenon of the morbidly obese teachers edition seems to not necessarily predict high quality. So I think sometimes in order to be compliant with every single agenda that somebody might have, they fill the teacher's edition up with one of everything. And the result is it's hard to figure out what to teach here. You pleased the committee because you had one of everything in there. But so I agree with that. I just would try to draw the distinction that sometimes a big, millions of colors teacher's edition may be comprehensive, but it might not do the thing that you were describing, which is to say, hey, teachers, here's the hard thing about this activity. Here's what could happen. Here are some things you should do when that happens. Like those giant ones that the publishers used to do don't have any of that stuff. They're just like, how to put it, just like content and then 100 little variants of the content to speak to a compliance requirement or a group that you may teach in your district that you want to. And so yes, but I still think it requires taste and discernment to see which of those it is.
Almost what I hear you saying is that we of course would accept that a curriculum needs to be intentionally designed for the student experience, but it needs to be as equally intentionally designed for the teacher experience as well, right?
Yeah,
exactly. And the one more thing I would say is some of the very best lessons that I've seen in the world, and every once in a while we're lucky to write one of these, are extraordinary for their restraint. Meaning they aren't showing you or delivering the content or telling kids how to do it. They are setting up a condition in which it is inevitable that kids would find their way to the understanding of this. And so from some lenses, you look at that lesson and you're like, but they're not teaching the 5 parts of magnetism that I was told I was supposed to teach. And the answer is because the teacher's given you these magnets and asked you to get the paper clips and in doing that, you learned all the things about those magnets, and the lesson doesn't have to be as explicit. And I think that's in the humanities, that's all over the place as well. But it can sometimes, like, the need to be compliant with all the standards can cause people to write everything into the lesson in a very explicit way that actually isn't a great teaching and learning experience. It's just a compliant textbook.
Yeah. And there was a question about what is the effect on teacher practice. And it sounds like we're talking about that, high quality instructional materials. I wonder if there's like there's probably research out there about the effect on teacher practice, but is there some anecdotal experience that Shanti chime in here too as well? Like, what happens when a teacher gets to use a high quality instructional material, and what is the effect on their practice?
Yeah, I mean, again, I have seen places where they adopt the program, but they aren't engaged in the change or the sort of disciplinary awareness and so they teach it the way they taught the old program. And then I've seen places where that same program really comes to life. And so, but I think I'm going to use some fancy words here, but the change often has to do with a heightened awareness of the subjectivity of the student in that learning process. Fancy words for saying the things that are not generally construed as high quality often have a quality of there's a bunch of stuff that is in my brain and I would like to now put it in your brain by saying it aloud. Yeah. And or maybe even writing it on the board and having you copy it down. What it means to pay attention to the subjectivity of the student is to say, this student comes to this work with certain things they understand and certain things they may not understand. And this is a new set of understandings we want them to have. And like, what's it like to be that student? What would it be like as a teacher to cultivate them on the journey from where they are? How can I use the assets and background knowledge and their own sense of identity to help them take a next academic step? And so that's the practice change, is that suddenly teachers are talking about the assets their kids have going into a lesson, the kind of work they are doing in the course of that lesson, and did it work? Did it not work? So there's something that one of us did that made it succeed, that the rest of us could learn from, and that's worth talking about because people are doing ambitious things instructionally, as opposed to we're just delivering the content that's in the page and then handing out the workbook. There's not a lot to talk about as teachers at the end of that day.
I think it's captured, you, Martin, some of the teachers that I think I'm most proud of, or our work I'm most proud of via them, is when a teacher says something like, I've heard this from a couple of teachers, that using our curriculum has reminded them of how capable their students are. Because especially in the days that we are in, it's easy to think like kids they just want to sit in front of screens all day, or I can't keep them engaged, or they have short attention spans and all those things. And so that reminder, I think, of what you're getting at, Larry, is that idea of like what students are actually capable of, and the curriculum that high quality instructional material should allow for the space for that capability to really come to the forefront.
I think that says it really, really well.
What are the one question was, what are the biggest barriers to the adoption of high quality instructional materials? Is it awareness? Is it buy-in, cost, politics? What do we do about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's cost. Sometimes it's politics. I mean, there's certainly no doubt that content is becoming politicized in our world today. I think the big one is, if it is doing something ambitious, it represents a change to previous practice. And if what we are looking for is something like what we did before, then there will be resistance to the high quality materials. If there's a prior conversation about a change we want to go through, about an ambition we're going to attempt in how we teach social studies going forward, then I think you've just overcome the biggest obstacle to adopting HQIM.
We have a question about assessment, and I haven't heard that word, and this person pointed it out. Like, what is the relationship between high quality instructional materials and assessment? And I think it gets back to a little bit of what you were talking about, Larry, about people cobbling together resources is a standard practice that teachers have to do. And when you do that, there is very little conscious designed assessment going on.
Yeah. I don't want to give a kind of monolithic answer to that, because I think that there is a version of the word quality in education. Sometimes people have used these terms like total quality management, a process brought across from factories into classrooms to say, like, the way we'll know that there's quality is every step of the way we teach a thing, we measure, did we succeed in teaching? If we didn't, we go back and reteach it. And that is a mindset about quality that I think there's a growing body of evidence can be quite counterproductive, especially for kids who are still developing their identity as a historian, as a mathematician, as a reader and writer. And so I think the question is an awareness of student work, and seems really important to me. I don't think there's any HQIM program that doesn't think really seriously about what are students writing? Are they writing a lot? What are they reading? What's the discourse about what they're reading? And there's definitely, to keep us honest, there should be moments where we stop and say, I think kids should be able to do this. Let's come up with a task and see if they're able to do it. But I think that's like, I have seen rigorous programs where there's a lot of measurement and a lot of response to it. And I don't want to say those are bad, but I've also seen ones that say, let's wake up each morning and tackle the tools of this discipline from another angle. Let's build knowledge, let's build on strengths, and let's not spend too much time measuring when we could be building. There's that classic proverb from farming that you can't fatten a cow by weighing it. You have to actually feed the cow. And so, spending more time just building enthusiasm for the discipline, getting kids to realize that talking about a book that they've read is a worthwhile activity, starts a flywheel turning of kids who are motivated to read, to talk, to write, to share ideas. And getting that flywheel turning may be more important than rigorously figuring out the measurement regime at each step of the way. And I think, I'll just say one more thing. I think the people who like the rigorously figure out the measurement regime are often folks who come to education from having kind of liked school. Like they thought it was fun to get good scores on tests. And for a lot of kids, that test is just a moment of, okay, I'm wrong. Why did the other kids get this and I'm wrong? Whereas the very same thing could have been a learning experience where a teacher was building on what that kid is right about, teasing out what assets they have, getting something going that gets them excited about the discipline, and then choosing the moment when it's like, hey, let's show what we know. Let's do a performance task. And so I'm not anti assessment, and I think assessment in early reading is like one of the most extraordinarily important things to do, just to make sure that kids aren't slipping through not knowing how to read and not having a reading disability that wasn't diagnosed. So I'm not an anti-measurement person. I just sometimes worry that people assert that quality means more and more measurement. And I think the real puzzle is how to do just the right amount of it, where a lot of what you're measuring is kids doing authentic tasks in the discipline, not getting right answers on quizzes.
And I think you also mentioned when we were talking about teacher practice, like the conversations that are happening amongst teachers about student learning, and sort of that seems to be that implies that assessment is also something that isn't just a score on a test, but it is a conversation between teachers about student learning, about whether things are working too. That's
yes. Okay, so yeah, I see the questioner refined that this is a sort of a question about efficacy and effectiveness and how do we know. I think it is a great point. It is very, very easy to believe that you've written something high quality and get a great reaction from teachers and the students seem motivated, and none of it is working. Actually, I think to have all of those things happen, something is working, but that the overall thing might not lead to efficacy. And so that is definitely, that's a different question of like, do we have some summative evaluative measures that are appropriate for looking at whether kids are growing? And of course, in reading and math, we do. States have tests and very often have interim assessments along the way that are pretty good at measuring growth over a time period. But in science and social studies, those things are thin on the ground, if they're at all. And so I think it actually, in those cases, has often required a kind of qualitative research folks who come in and do, not based on the state test measures, but based on what's the type of analysis I'm talking about? A sort of a more formative and human evaluative process where they are checking on what's the quality of the work, what's the quality of the engagement. And then the nice thing is, like, a good social studies or science program should be showing up in reading comprehension scores as well. And there are some studies that we were lucky to have one working with WestEd in our science curriculum, where we actually could show statistically significant effects on reading from a very reading intensive science program. And I think the questioner is asking about that, like, is the apparatus that makes the case that some of these things are more effective than others, is it there? Because that would also, to the fundamental question is, how do we know if it's HQIM? The right answer should be, I should have said, we evaluate them, and the kids who do better in a program, that's the effective one, assuming we're evaluating the right stuff. And the challenge, the only reason we didn't go there is those rigorous scientific studies are not very common. They are hard to do. They involve random assignment. And so for most things, even in ELA and math, there just aren't a lot. I'm guessing in social studies, it's not a discipline I know well. Shanti's shaking her head. There's just not gold standard research of that sort. But I'm a big believer in the fact that, like, experts in the discipline can see it. Like, go visit the schools and don't just look at, do kids like it, but look at the work they're doing. Is the work showing progressions of learning? And I think that might be the closest shot at real efficacy data.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, and in past webinars I've asked this, and I think I'll ask it now, is there's sort of like what's on your nightstand kind of question. Like, what, Larry, I want to ask you, what are you currently, like, is really piquing your curiosity? And it doesn't have to be in the world of high quality instructional materials, but what is something that, if you were to say, if this was like a sort of a cocktail chatter kind of piece, like, what would you say that you're sort of really interested in or into right now that you might want to put a plug in for?
I have become kind of obsessed about the question of attention and how it is at the very center of what we mean when we say kids are engaged and that they do quality work. There isn't such a thing as doing quality work without sustained attention to a difficult task. And I think part of what happened during the pandemic is parents watched how difficult that was for their kids, that they couldn't actually, like, you don't see it in school and when your kids go off to school, but when they're sitting at home, they can't actually sustain attention in many cases. And the pandemic radically exacerbated it. At some point, the kids gave up, the parents got tired, go use TikTok, whatever, just get out of my hair. And a $1 trillion industry is in the business of extracting kids' attention into the apps and tools and social medias that they have. And compared to that, a small social studies curriculum trying to get their attention is outmanned and outgunned. But I don't think that it is inevitably going to lose that battle. If it is strong and the teachers who represent it are strong, it's got a shot. But I think we have to get serious about what attention is and help kids understand that it's a tool that they are currently essentially selling their attention to the highest bidder. They don't know it, but that's what happens each time they go on TikTok. And that's not okay, that it is the thing that makes them who they are. It is the thing that will enable them to do ambitious things, to learn, to think for themselves. And but they have to realize that their attention is theirs. It's not subject to whatever app or game they're addicted to, and that they get to make choices about where they put it. And I think schools have to figure out how to create this awareness. The the thing that is said so often, pay attention, even just in the way we say it, has a transactional quality. I would like you to pay the attention, as opposed to like, let's understand the power of attending on this text, attending on this question, attending on this work of art. And what happens when a bunch of human beings do that together and try to share their impressions and ideas, what they learn from each other, what they learn about that work of art, what they and what they come to understand about the power of their attention. And I think that issue of sustained attention, that kids don't have as much capacity to do it as, like, all veteran teachers tell me that's the case. I think all parents are lamenting that that's the case. Figuring out what it means to engage in what a group of people I know are starting to refer to as radical attention practices, things that get people to become aware, in that sense of radical, of how their attention works, who's using it, how do they get it back, and what do they want to attend upon, and what's the power of attending on things in a classroom with your friends and with the teacher. And that is actually the thing we're trying to do. It's just have sustained attention on difficult work. And I think we currently start with an assumption that kids can't do that. And then that leads down a path of, well, what would it take to have enough pyrotechnics that they pay attention for a moment? And that might be part of the problem rather than the solution.
I love what you said there, Larry. And I just have to add one thing. I think what you're talking about actually is, especially in education, providers will often use the word engagement. Look how engaged kids are, because they put a lot of pyrotechnics into it and said, okay, great, I can get the kid to stare at this for a while. And is that the kind of attention that we want to be supporting students and actually developing in terms of the productive struggle that you're talking about in terms of attention? So I love that you're leaving us with that. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while, so I appreciate it. Thanks, Martin, for leading the Q&A today. Thank you all for the great questions. Thank you so much, Larry, for joining us today. I know you're traveling, and appreciate you taking the time with us.
Absolutely. I'm in Nashville, so that's why there's a guitar behind me. So I saw that the Social Studies Conference that is sponsoring us is in Nashville. Come to Nashville. It's lovely. The pictures of guitars in the hotel.
And CSS will very much appreciate the plug. So thank you so much, Larry. Thanks all. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
Take care.